webinar, Maximizing Parking Availability, Safety, and Revenue at Your Organization. My name is Jennifer Saunders. I'm the Marketing Director here at All Traffic Solutions, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I want to let you know that there is a questions box at the bottom of your control panel. So you can privately submit questions during the presentation, and we will answer them at the end. Also, you will be receiving an emailed link to the recorded presentation so you can watch the webinar again and share it with colleagues. And now I would like to introduce today's speaker, John Fagan, Director of Parking and Transportation for All Traffic Solutions. A bit about John: he is a master parking management problem solver. John works with All Traffic Solutions customers to customize the right parking solution based on their specific parking management challenges. He's helped dozens of organizations, including state, local, federal government agencies, universities, large corporate clients, and hospitals. And now, John Fagan.
Thanks, Jennifer. Wow, that's a pretty big introduction. I don't know if I can live up to that, but I will certainly try. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today. For those that don't know me, again, my name's John Fagan. I'm the Director of Parking and Transportation here at All Traffic Solutions. But I've been in the parking industry for about 10 years or so. And today, as Jennifer mentioned, we're going to talk about maximizing your parking revenue, specifically really by understanding your parking availability in your facilities, while at the same time really increasing your customers' safety. So there's really two themes as we delve into the presentation. First and foremost, maximizing revenue. So the reality of society really hasn't changed, right? So you've got a limited amount of resources that you need to try to maximize. So as parking organizations have developed over time, I don't know of anybody that has an unlimited budget that can spend whatever they want, whenever they want. So it's all about trying to maximize what you have. And I think there are, as we go through the presentation today, there are plenty of new technologies or emerging trends in the technology that allow you to do that. But at the same time, really, populations are increasing, customer bases are increasing, all you have to do, I won't delve into politics, but obviously you get a lot more aggressiveness in really any part of society, but also specifically in parking and transportation. So, accidents are up. We've got, aggressive driving is on the rise. So how can you maximize your parking revenue, but at the same time keeping everybody happy, whether that's keeping them safe or also keeping your parkers and your employees happy. So that's really what so in some cases, it's, there's a battle that you have to fight to manage that, but that's what we're really going to talk about today. So by way of an agenda, we're going to look at really what parking professionals struggle with most, really in today's world. We'll look at, how we can gain efficiencies, but specifically how we can look at the transportation industry or the transportation departments as well as parking departments. We're seeing a lot of those, roles kind of be combined or potentially merged. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're really going to focus on the latest technology that's out there in parking, specifically for wayfinding and availability. One thing that I didn't mention, obviously I've been in parking for a while now. I am a member of the IPI Technology Committee for the next 2 years. And really one of the themes for 2018 for IPI is wayfinding. So trying to understand all of the choices that that a driver or a parker has from the moment that they step into their vehicle. So really trying to identify those. We'll talk about those trends, that technology that's out there today, where I see that going, and what that means for the parking operations as a whole. And then we'll talk about pedestrian safety, ways to increase pedestrian, but also parking safety as well. And then finally, once we understand all of those things, all of the sort of the data that's out there, we're going to try to try to figure out what we can do with that. So how do we make things better? That's the analytics piece of it. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. Couple of housekeeping items. I know Jennifer did mention it, but there will be time to ask questions at the end. If you have questions, there is a chat feature or a question feature box that you can type those questions in. If I don't get to them during the presentation, I'll certainly try to cover those at the end. And so if you don't think of something at the time you want, we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. So I want to talk a little bit about just parking in general, or the historical aspects of parking. So, for the longest time in parking, and for those of you that have been in parking as long as I have, or candidly, there's quite a few people that I know that have been out there in parking for a lot longer, hardware was the main focus of our operations. So in a nutshell, everything, was hardware driven, whether that's single slot meters, whether that's access and revenue control systems, or handwritten tickets that were being enforced on the streets. Everything was very hardware driven. And, from the software or technological aspect, everything was very closed architecture. So if you think about it, no system really talked to another system. In some cases, people were using, at best, Excel spreadsheets, at worst, file cabinets upon file cabinets of handwritten notes that they had collected over time. But they didn't have a way of really connecting any of that information. So, about 10 to 15 years ago, there started to develop a trend to really try to fix that. And, today the buzzword is sort of Internet of Things. So for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, all that essentially means is any device that can connect to the internet has the ability to capture data. So whether that's your phone, whether that's a meter, whether that's a parking garage, or a parking garage gate, all of those systems, we slowly started to see a shift to a software-based or flexible software, mobile solutions. But the key is that they are accessible to the internet. And by becoming accessible to the internet, they have the ability to capture that data and then record that data so you can keep it and measure it over time. So that's what we're starting to see by way of trends, but really initially it wasn't like that. So you didn't have that ability. And like I said, that's slowly started to change, but there are still some shortcomings that are out there. So specifically today, there isn't a holistic view of your parking industry or your parking inventory. So if you think about it, most parking operations have several different layers or several different components to be part of your operations. Even if you don't have a transportation department that you are also managing, you usually will have some form of multiple ways for people to park, whether that's a parking garage and a surface lot, or on-street and off-street parking. There are multiple ways for the people to get to where they want to park. So you've got, as I mentioned, you've got garages, you've got lots, you've got meters. In a lot of cases, you will have to manage special events. And in some cases, you'll have permitted parkers. So whether that's a university and all of your students or faculty have to wear or carry permits, but also if you're a municipality, you have residential permit programs as part of it. So you have a lot of different ways and different types of parkers, but a lot of times, and in most cases, you don't have real-time information. So in other words, you don't have a way to know what your inventory looks like at that specific, your entire inventory at that specific moment. If you have a parking garage, you might know what your availability looks like in that garage, but you don't know what your availability is in your surface lots or in your on-street program. You may not know that stuff. And in all of those cases, or in almost all of those cases, each one of those different types of situations has a separate system that you have to look it up. So you may only be able, you could look and see in your garages if you look to your access and revenue control company and their software or their platform. But if you wanted to know what your surface lots are or your meter program is, you'd have to go to those different vendors. So you don't have, in a lot of cases, you don't have the way to manage that in one meaningful format or meaningful view, whether that's a dashboard or some other reporting mechanism so you can see that in real time. As a result of not knowing that real-time availability, your wayfinding suffers. So, there are statistics out there that really show that 30% of traffic in any given city is, at any given time, is people looking for a place to park. And that's pretty, that's a pretty, stunning statistic if you think about it. Of all the drivers that you see in any given city or any given place, 30% of those are just looking for a place to park. And that makes for less happy drivers. It makes for less happy business owners because it's taking their constituents or their customers longer to get parked, so they can spend less time in their stores. And then, because of that, because they're looking for places to park, and because you don't necessarily have that visibility in real time to your inventory, you can't maximize some of the information that's currently available. So, for example, there are lots of different apps that are out there today that can tell you where you can go to park. Typically, however, what they don't tell you is what the current or real-time availability is. So, for example, if I'm in Washington, D.C., and I click or I Google where to park, or I look up an app and it will tell me where to park, what it typically will tell me is the nearest surface lot or garage, based on my my location, what the rate is and how many spaces there are. But it doesn't tell me if there are actually spaces there to park. So when I get there, I could be pretty frustrated to find out that there isn't any availability. So now I have to go somewhere else. So, without that real-time data, you can't understand how your organization is currently functioning, but also how it is changing and how it's adapting. So, for example, you might start to see, if you had that real-time availability, you might be able to start to see what your trends look like. So at certain times of day, you might see peaks or spikes in parking and then be able to act accordingly. Or, potentially, as we talk about transportation departments, you might be able to change traffic patterns to help alleviate some of those spikes or peaks. Or from a revenue perspective, you may want to maximize those peaks. So, you may look at, and we'll talk a little bit about dynamic pricing for your parking. So if there are certain times of day where you're seeing a spike in parking or people that are coming in, maybe you want to increase your pricing. So we'll talk a little bit about that as you go. But all of that allows you really to plan for the future, but unfortunately, you don't really have that option or a lot of those options currently. So, because of all of those, drivers that are looking for parking, you've got that issue of, you've got 30% of people looking for a place to park. What that causes is potential safety concerns. So, for example, you've got, I think there's another statistic that basically shows, 1 in 4 accidents are parking related, whether that's in a facility, someone that's looking for a place to park. So again, those are some pretty significant numbers that are out there, and quite frankly, those numbers are only growing over time. So you've got a lot of people that are looking to get out to a place to park. They're becoming upset because they may not be able to find a place to park, and so you've got to be able to react accordingly. And the reality is, expansion, just adding more parking spaces is not really an option for most organizations. So, real estate is expensive. You generally don't, and costly as well if you need to buy or build another parking structure, even erect a surface lot. So you need to know what the availability looks like so that then you can act or react accordingly so that you can better manage or better maximize that revenue. So spread it out over time, potentially raise some of the individual rates, because again, you're starting to see more drivers circling for places to park. That affects parkers, that affects your drivers in potential accidents. It also affects pedestrians. I've talked to quite a few organizations over the last year or so that have been talking to me about simply trying to get people to slow down in their garages. So you get, again, people that are trying to get in and get parked, but they are driving through through a garage or through a lot at a higher rate of speed than what they used to do. So you're seeing higher rates or higher accident rates with pedestrians. So what can you do about that as well? That's one of the other underlying concerns that are out there. So, once you get people parked, now there are issues, in today's world about managing or understanding what that data looks like. So, for example, when you have a parking garage, typically speaking, and in some cases, some surface lots, if you may have, if it's a gated facility, you may have the ability to understand what the occupancy looks like, but is that occupancy accurate? In other words, or I'll give you an example. So I was in Reston, Virginia, a few months back, and I went to a parking garage where I was meeting somebody for lunch. We went into the parking garage. They had a wayfinding system, and that wayfinding system said that there were over 100 spaces in a 500-space garage that were available. And we went up and down a 7-story garage. In fact, I think it might have been more than 7 stories. And we went up and down that entire garage, and there was not one space that was available. Obviously, that led to quite a bit of frustration. That made us late for our lunch. That made the people that were waiting for us, upset as well, because we were relying on bad data. So in a lot of cases, you've got loops that might be able to track or count for systems, but how accurate is that count? So, everybody knows one of the shortcomings of a traditional loop is that you've got tailgaters. So if people are coming in right behind the person in front of you, it may not pick up that car, or that extra car. And if you get more people in there and you don't account for those, you're going to be off. But then more importantly, over time, because not any system is going to be 100% accurate, you're going to get worse and worse, less and less accurate on your count. So then you will start to see some pretty significant differences in what your occupancy what your occupancy is showing and what your actual occupancy is. So it's not to say that loops are a completely outdated method. They're not. There are certainly loops that are out there that can maintain accuracy, but you need to understand what your particular system is and whether there are those shortcomings, whether the loops are too close together, or are you using a different type system? So for example, I've worked and talked to quite a number of different airports or high volume parking garages where they are starting to track occupancy even by levels, but they need it to be very accurate. So they are seeking bids for systems that just simply provide occupancy counts. So even though you're still going to have loops in the garage, you're also putting in an occupancy system that's solely there to track and provide an accurate occupancy count, because it is so important in those high volume garages. So you're starting to see more and more of that. And then, in today's world, if you're outside of a parking garage, in a lot of cases, organizations don't have a way of tracking occupancy other than doing manual counts. So, for example, if I live in Tampa, there are quite a number of different surface lots, and they are, in some cases, manned and in other cases unmanned. But without somebody doing a visual inspection, you have no way of knowing what the availability looks like for those surface lots. Even for, on-street parking, you might see at the end of the day how many transactions occurred, but you may not know what your availability looks like at any given time for your metered parking. So, and what essentially that leads to is you can have those inaccurate counts, but it also can result in shrinkage. So everyone in parking is familiar with the term or the idea of, attendants or people that can, pocket money without processing through a transaction. So, for example, if you've got an event or just, daily parkers that come in, it used to be it was all cash transactions. We have, the technology has gotten better in that in most cases they are either using a cashier station or a handheld to process the transactions, which is great. It certainly increases the transaction accuracy, but what it doesn't do is prevent somebody from basically just not processing that transaction. Now, there's certainly ways that you can do that. If everybody's coming in at the same time and you're starting to see big gaps in the transactions, obviously that's going to raise some red flags. But there are other ways where if you are tracking the occupancy of the vehicles coming in and reconciling that with the transactions that occurred, you essentially have a checks and balances. So you've got ways to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of new technological concepts or advancements in parking, really in society in general, right? So I talked about the Internet of Things. You're seeing more and more devices, connected devices, connecting with each other. So you've got a lot of integrations with meters and access and revenue control companies, as well as sensor-based systems, but even CCTV security cameras. So you've got a lot of different options that are out there, and a lot of different technology that can provide much more efficient operations, more accurate or cost-effective operations. And we're going to talk a little bit about that specifically as we go through the availability and safety features that we talked about earlier. So, one of the things I mentioned before was, the idea of, we're seeing a lot more organizations combining their parking and transportation departments. So I know quite a number of different universities that already have, a merged department. They are managing bus and transit systems as well as parking operations. And you're starting to see, the combined efforts of that. So, for example, I've worked with some organizations where not only are they providing, digital or variable message signs for parking, but they're also displaying what the bus times are, what the bus occupancy looks like as well. So people, again, can start making informed decisions, or they're pushing that data to their university app or their customer website to let people know, hey, this bus is running full or this train is running full. It might be better to go, to use an alternate route. So the key is trying to get that information to their fingertips in real time. So you're starting to see that more and more. And then that also allows you to plan for the future. So, for example, taking a university as an example, if you can track the parkers and know, when people are coming on campus and when it is the busiest, you can supply that data to your university to let people know, maybe we need to change class schedules because the campus is overly busy at one time and not at all busy at others. So there are different ways that you can use that data, and we'll talk about that as we go through the analytics, but you're starting to see more and more, merged technologies because there are some similar needs. You're also seeing it in the world today, really, if you think about it, with Google Maps and Waze. Obviously, they're providing real-time traffic information. They are now starting to layer in parking information as well. And then, you can take, for example, there are apps that are out there as an example, in Denver and LA, where you can track your rides. You can see, if you need to get from point A to point B, what the fastest, what the greenest, what the most economical ways are to get there. But now they're also adding in or combining, where they can go to park, or potentially reserving a place to park while you're doing that, because it's all, sort of comes under the umbrella of the same thing. So and that kind of goes back to what IPI is looking at for next year, right? So it's taking your parker, your commuter from start to finish. So that's getting them into their vehicle and out of their vehicle as fast as possible. So those departments really can and do merge. So you're starting to see that more and more. There's also new ways to really help maximize, your overall revenue. So if you think about it, we talked about, paying, paid parking, right? So you've got a lot of companies that are out there that are trying to help you sell your inventory. So if you have 100 spaces, obviously you're trying to get, just the everyday parker, the person that comes by to pull into your facilities to get them to pay and pay for their parking. But you're also using or leveraging other companies to help advertise or help drive those consumers into your facilities through apps that your end users might be using. But the reality is, those are fixed numbers, right? So you're selling, those organizations are selling a fixed number of spaces that the then app providers are trying to sell. But what you don't know is what is your occupancy. So if you know what your occupancy is, can you sell more spaces? Or, if those spaces are going left unsold, does it make more sense for you to take less money, in other words, sharing the money with the app company and getting some revenue, or leaving those spaces go, completely empty and driving no revenue in? So if you know what your occupancy is, you know how many spaces that you can sell or offer up to other companies to try to go out and market and sell. Same thing with permits and event parking. So for residential permits, obviously, if you're tracking it, you can start to see how many people are actually using the facility. And in fact, there's so Florida International University today, for their residential permits, they don't use physical permits. They make everyone download an app, and they enforce the app by, as the vehicles come on campus, they can determine, they match the vehicle using LPR cameras with the with the app that they're using. So they match the app with the vehicle and allow the person to park. If the person doesn't have a permit associated with that vehicle, they can go out and enforce. And likewise, for ride-sharing programs, they need two people in a vehicle with phones that are using that app, and they have an algorithm that basically determines it has to be in a certain proximity so it knows that there are two people in that vehicle. And if they don't, again, they can go out and enforce. So again, it's about, trying to maximize your revenue without, in that case, they don't have to produce physical permits, but then they can also go out and enforce and drive their revenue. They've actually seen a pretty significant increase in revenue by having to enforce a lot of new, citations that are out there. That wasn't necessarily what they were trying to do. They really just wanted to drive enforcement or drive, educational, just their policies. But they've seen a pretty significant increase in ticket or enforcement revenue because of that. And then likewise, we talked about event parking before. Again, if you know what your occupancy is in real time, you'll know, you can reconcile that with the transactions that have occurred. So even if you're using a handheld that verifies or provides, copies or receipts of the transactions, you still don't know how many cars came in. So if you have a way of verifying that, you can add that extra layer of authentication or verification so you can maximize that revenue. So really eliminate any of the shrinkage that's out there, because those numbers would have to add up. If 100 vehicles came in and it costs $1 to park, there better be $100 at the end of the day. Otherwise, something went wrong. Somebody pocketed money or somebody didn't pay to park. And so it'd be pretty easy to determine that pretty quickly. So there's a lot of new technology, and you can track occupancy, as we talked about before, you can track occupancy off streets as well as surface lots, but you can even do that on streets through sensors or cameras and or meters. So here's an example of where you can start to track occupancy. In this case, these are, think of it as like a shopping mall. So there's long aisles and there are sensors in every space. And so now you can start to see in real time what your occupancy looks like. So at 8:38 a.m., there are 17 occupied spaces. So that's the O, and there are 13 available spaces. So again, this goes back to knowing exactly what your inventory looks like, so you know if you need to sell more spaces or advertise more spaces. But then in addition, let's say that these are metered spaces, you can set alerts, which is what you would see on the top of the screen, to let you know that somebody has come into that space and hasn't paid. So, before, the meter attendant, as they walked their beat, they could see if somebody didn't pay. They would either go to the pay station and pull the report, or they could look at it on their handheld and see and then match it up. But they didn't. Now there's ways that you can immediately get an alert that says somebody entered this space and didn't pay. So you can immediately go out and enforce. So it's the same concept of zeroing out a meter so that nobody gets that extra time. Nowadays, you can actually enforce immediately if somebody has not paid to park. So there's different ways that you can do that as well. So once you have that information, so what do you do with it? Well, we talked about what you really want to do is get that information into your customers' hands as soon as possible. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. And obviously you can see some examples here of some dynamic messaging. You can start to see what the availability looks like. You can position these signs outside of a garage or a lot, or really around campus in the streets of your city, and direct people to traffic. But then you can also push this information to, whether you have your organization's app, or you can have an app developed that will show you where that space, where there is availability. So you can start to see, you can see here, you can direct people, directly to, you can direct people into the spaces themselves. So, and even potentially have them reserve their space in that process. So there's lots of different ways. There are some people and some customers that I've talked to that use Twitter quite frequently. Some organizations do, some organizations don't. But there are ways that you can put that up in real time, what the availability looks like for your facilities via Twitter. So whatever, again, it's about knowing what your customers, it's knowing your constituency. So what do your customers use the most, and where, so that's how you would want to distribute, disseminate that information. So whether that's through signage across campus or across the city, whether that's through your app that will show all of your surface lots or your garages or your on-street parking, or whether that's through Twitter or a website or some other feature. So lots of different ways that you can do that. And likewise, you can even push that to some of the ride-sharing companies that are out there. So lots of different ways to do that. So again, it's just about knowing that. And then by implementing this, this type of data, that's where you can start to see, increase in safety. So we already talked about, how much traffic is out there. 30% of the cars on the road are looking for places to park. The quicker you can get them information, the quicker they can make their decisions, and the quicker they can get parked, obviously is going to reduce congestion and, create a safer environment. So that's obviously going to increase safety, but also there are other ways that you can, provide, sort of traffic calming, instances. So again, I've talked to a lot of organizations where they have started to implement vehicle detection systems and traffic calming initiatives in parking garages. So whether that's a speed enforcement sign to get them to slow down, flashing lights or a sign saying they're going too fast, but also wrong way detection. So if you are going the wrong way down or up a garage, or even a pedestrian indicator. So in a lot of cases, you've got some blind turns and or blind spots where pedestrians might be trying to cross, whether you're exiting a parking garage or entering, and you may not be able to see them. They've got bollards that you can put or signs where you can put to let your drivers know that a pedestrian has entered the roadway or is nearing the roadway. So again, it's all about getting data to your customers, to your drivers in real time to let them react or act accordingly. And then likewise, if you've got, if you're in a city or a university and there are traffic, and again, this goes back to merging or combining those transportation and parking initiatives, but if you've got accident alerts, congestion alerts, if you let people know that information in advance, it can help dictate or change behavior. So for example, again, I live in the city of Tampa, so if there is an accident on the bridge to go from Tampa to St. Pete, and I can get that information to my customers by way of a message board in the garage, letting them know, hey, drive time to St. Petersburg is, double because of an accident. That lets me change, basically, lets me avoid that, or potentially, lets me fix or help reduce some of that traffic congestion by providing alternate routes. So there's different ways that you can do that, but all of that is going to lead to, increased safety, but also your customer satisfaction will go up as well because, again, they're getting that information in real time. So now that you have all of that data, what do you do with it? So, everybody uses, and we've been using this term for a while now, is data analytics, and it's a really cool term, but it's really important to understand what analytics means. So getting the data is great, but that's really only half the battle. That is not analytics. It's taking that data and using it in some meaningful way. That's what makes it, that's what lets you analyze it. That's what true analytics are. So now that you have that data, all of those, Internet of Things, those connected devices, how do you take that data and then use it in meaningful formats? So here's a couple of examples of some heat maps or some traffic and parking reports that let you see what your availability looks like. And then you can start to plan. So whether that's, if you need to increase enforcement, during those high peak or, high volume times, you can do that. Whether you want to have, and I mentioned this earlier, the dynamic pricing. Now, obviously, in a university or municipal market, there's obviously other concerns, the legalities of them or the approval process that you may have to go through to do it. But again, if by having this data, you can start to see and show what that will look like, and then you could also run reports to show your constituency or your bosses, your organization, what your revenue will look like if by increasing your rates. So for example, if you're a hospital and you see the busiest traffic, between 11 and 1, and you want to raise your rates during that time, you can start to run some regression analysis and see what your revenue will look like if you increase that, your rates for that period of time for the next year. So you can see what your revenue would look like if you don't increase it, and then what it'll look like if you do increase it. So lots of different options that are available. But again, the key is having accurate data. So I talked about lots of different ways that you can provide accurate counts. There's a lot of new ways to do that, whether that's through your smart meters, your flexible software in your garage systems, but also your counting, whether that's through cameras, lasers, or what have you, to provide accurate counts in surface lots and on-street programs. the key is getting that, getting accurate data so that then you can react or act accordingly. So then that also allows you to plan for the future as well. So that's really the analytics. And then I was just going to just mention briefly a case study that I've worked with in the past. So the University of North Texas is a very forward-thinking organization in the university sector. But candidly, I mean, it's, universities are very similar to municipal environments. They have to manage on-street, large universities have to manage on-street and off-street programs, as well as events and transportation departments. And the parking helps inform class scheduling, but also, future planning as well. One of their issues was, they have quite a number of different parking lots and garages, but they don't, they have, several high volume areas that are very difficult to find parking for. So you've got students circling and faculty circling for parking, which then makes them late for class, makes them unhappy, makes, just the parking department's lives unhappy as well, having to deal with that. Leads to congestion, like I said, that'll create traffic issues, safety issues as well. So just overall frustration levels. So what they had decided to do was really, put in counting systems in about 20 of their busiest surface lots, and then looking at doing, providing that variable message signs to show what that availability is, but also provide an app, a parking app for their students and faculty, letting them know in real time what that availability looks like for those 12 lots. And I think the intentions are to expand that over time, but they wanted to start with the 20 busiest. But then also looking at providing bollards to show that as well. So a visual as they are driving, as they are approaching facilities, letting them see that so that if they, before they start to enter the lot and drive around, if they see that it's already full, they can just keep proceeding to the next lot. And then again, sending that information or that availability information to their apps in real time. So what, by doing that, now there's some pretty, the technology is out there. It can be, pretty much plug and play. So they can get the equipment, hook it up and have it installed inside of a day. That really doesn't, it's not as intrusive. You don't have loop issues. You don't have issues with shutting down the facility so that you have to, because you have to physically cut a loop in to your lot or what have you. And then that provides, it provides highly accurate counts. I think in their case, there's, they're talking about over 98% accuracy. And then you've got wayfinding signs that'll, reduce congestion and really increase your satisfaction levels for your parkers, but just your overall customer, your university base. So by doing all of that, you get, a much more, or, healthier parking environment, for lack of better words. But that's really as a result of the technology that's out there. You get a safer environment, but you also can maximize your revenue, your parking revenue, because you're seeing what the parking is, you're acting on that parking data, and then you're allowing or streamlining people to get to where they need to be in a quick and meaningful way. So with that, I know I've covered a lot of information. I want to make sure that I answer any questions that are out there. So Jennifer, if there are any questions, just let me know. I'll be happy to try to answer any.
Sure. We do have a couple. Just a quick reminder to the attendees, if you have a question for John, just type it into the questions section on your control panel, and we will either get to it now or personally after the webinar. John, so the first question is, how do you see rideshare companies affecting parking facilities in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. So, and actually, interestingly, for those that weren't there, I was just at the National Parking Association conference. Both Uber and Waze, so ride sharing, but also just directional or traffic systems, gave presentations. They were very well attended. And I think the key is obviously using, I think they said by 2020 there's going, I forget the exact number, but there's going to be quite a few self-driving cars that are out there. So how do you account for those? I still think there's going to be, quite a number of parkers that are out there. They might use those ride-sharing apps. But the one thing that you're seeing, is, again, providing data in meaningful format. So, today, most cases, you're just getting static data, or just, how many space, where there are lots, how many spaces total there are in those lots, and what the rate is for those lots. I think what you're seeing with the Google Maps and Waze and Uber and Lyft is you're going to start to see, more of that availability information in those, in those apps. So, in the Google Maps and Waze right now, it can tell you what the best routes are, but I think you're going to start to see additional layers for parking. I know specifically for Waze, that was one of the things that it's on their roadmap. It's not, it's not coming in the next year or so, but it's certainly, they want to get more data, so they want to take that information to be able to provide for it. And then, with Uber and Lyft, you're going to start to see, more people doing rideshare programs, but I think that will also lead to, like, as I mentioned before, you're going to start to see more ride-sharing programs as part of your parking operations. So I think you have to adapt to it. So how do you prove that somebody, came in and parked when they're using a rideshare program? It's offering those types of discounts, but also being able to enforce. So I talked about how Florida International is doing it, which I think is a really neat, it's a really great concept. It's working very well, and it's also driving a significant amount of revenue for that organization. So I think you're going to see similar things like that in the parking space, and I think that's how you're going to see the most change, or the most direct impact in parking, certainly in the near future.
Okay, thank you. We actually have one more question. What are the options if you have multiple facilities that just aren't performing well? They're just underperforming.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think the key there is, it's understanding why, right? So are they underperforming because, you're not seeing anyone park there, but you're seeing, you're just seeing all of your parking elsewhere? And, so why is that? Is it off the beaten path, or is it, that's just where people don't like going there? Most people understand that, or at least in the parking world, the reality is you generally don't have a parking problem, you have a preferred parking problem, right? So everybody, there's in almost all cases, you have enough spaces to park people. They just don't want to park where you have those spaces, right? So the key is, okay, so how do you fix that, right? So if you have an underperforming lot, well, maybe, as you're overperforming or your busy lots fill up, you can redirect them using variable message signs. So, for example, as that lot reaches capacity, maybe you say, well, this is where you should go to find your place to park. Or maybe as an example, if it's underperforming, maybe you say, okay, I'm going to offer a discounted rate to get people to park there. So I'm going to, to try to drive revenue for that facility. So again, it's all about having the information at your fingertips to understand what the problem is, and then be able to act accordingly. So those are a couple different ways that I would say to do that off the top of my head.
Okay. But certainly some options to try. Well, that's actually all the time that we have for today's webinar. I would like to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you, John. You can contact All Traffic Solutions from our website Contact Us page, and we hope to hear from you. Thank you, and enjoy your afternoon. This concludes today's broadcast.